Robert, thank you so much for your wonderful introduction, which I enormously appreciate. And it's made it much easier for me now to come up and speak. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a huge privilege to be here today to be addressing the 32nd International Churchill Conference. I'd like to thank Alan Packwood for everything that he and his team at the Archives Centre do to keep the memory of Winston Churchill alive and accurate, and the conference president, Celia Sands, and Derek Greenwell, and all their team for arranging this wonderful event. And my son, Randolph, who does so much for the memory of Winston Churchill. It is 50 years since Winston Churchill died, and 100 years since he started painting. My lecture will be on Winston Churchill and his paintings, and it will be divided into two parts. I will first talk about Sir Winston, and then Simon Bird, who is here with me, and I will show you a selection of his paintings and also some photographs. Together with David Coombs, the art historian, we have produced a book on the paintings. It took us 6 years, and we managed to track down over 500 of his paintings and one sculpture. I knew Sir Winston only in the very last years of his amazing life. The first time that I met him was in 1963, when Winston, grandson of Sir Winston, invited me to lunch with him and his grandfather at 28 Hyde Park Gate, which was the London home of Sir Winston and Lady Churchill. I was rather nervous. I didn't know very much about politics and wondered what we would talk about. However, I need not have been. We had a wonderful time with my Winston talking to his grandfather about a flight he had recently made round Africa in a single-engine plane. Sir Winston then proceeded to tell us about his travels in Africa as a young man, and in particular, he talked about his experiences in the Boer War. Just before the end of lunch, he rang the bell for the butler and asked him to bring the cream jug back. He poured the cream directly onto the dining room table, and Jock, his lovely ginger cat, jumped onto his lap and then onto the table where he lapped up the cream. I thought how special it was that he cared so much about his cat, but I hated to think what Lady Churchill would have thought. That summer, Winston took me down to Chartwell, their lovely home in Kent. The house was empty, and we had a wonderful time exploring the garden with its beautiful view across the Weald of Kent. And we then went into the house, and I could not believe what I saw in the dining room. There were, neatly stacked on the floor, row upon row of canvases, hundreds of paintings. I knelt down to have a closer look at the paintings. There were magnificent landscapes, seascapes, still lives, as well as the occasional portrait. I knew that Winston painted, but I had no idea that he was so prolific. I also had no idea that some 20 years later, I would be running Churchill Heritage, which owns the copyright to his paintings. Painting became a very important part of Winston's life. Winston started painting in 1915. It was after Gallipoli and the disastrous Dardanelles campaign, when he lost his government job as First Lord of the Admiralty. He thought that his career was finished. Many years later, Clementine Churchill was to tell Winston's biographer, Martin Gilbert, that looking back over all the events and crises through which they both had lived, and in which Winston had played a major part, none had been so searing as the drawn-out campaign of the Dardanelles, with its heavy toll of life and bitter aftermath. My grandfather, Major H.J. Samet, was killed at Gallipoli. He was in the Essex Regiment. But my grandmother never put the blame on Winston Churchill. She always told our family that Admiral Fisher was to blame because he delayed the invasion, and as a result, the Germans and the Turks were waiting for them. But you'll all hear about that later on this afternoon. That summer, Winston and Clementine rented a small house called Hoe Farm near Godalming in Surrey. They would weekend there with their 3 children, Diana, Sarah, and Randolph. Clementine Churchill described her husband, stooped in deepest thought, pacing up and down the long grass path at the top of the garden, from the copse of young trees at one end to the wooden summer house at the other. Nothing could distract him. She despaired of ever seeing him unworried. His depression frightened her. He could find no comfort or relaxation. Clementine Churchill later told Winston's biography that she felt he would die of grief. I felt that without the discovery of painting, he surely might have done. Winston, in a most moving article published in the 1920s, wrote, "When I left the Admiralty at the end of May 1915, I remained a member of the Cabinet and of the War Council. In this position, I knew everything and could do nothing. The change from the intensive executive activities of each day's work at the Admiralty to the narrowly measured duties of a councillor left me gasping. Like a sea beast fished from the depth, or a diver too suddenly hoisted, my veins threatened to burst from the fall of pressure. I had great anxiety and no means of relieving it. I had vehement conviction and small power to give effect to them. I had to watch the unhappy casting away of great opportunities and the feeble execution of plans which I had launched and in which I heartily believed. I had long hours of utter unwanted leisure in which to contemplate the frightful unfolding of the war. At a moment when every fibre of my being was being inflamed to action, I was forced to remain a spectator of the tragedy, placed cruelly in a front seat. And then it was that the muse of painting came to my rescue, out of charity and out of chivalry, because, after all, she had nothing to do with me, and she said, 'Are these toys any good to you? They amuse some people.' It happened like this. One weekend, his sister-in-law, Goonie, was staying with them, and Winston discovered her painting in watercolours in the garden. He watched her for a few minutes and then borrowed her brush and tried his hand at painting. He was immediately hooked. Very soon he was experimenting with oils, buying all the equipment that he needed. He wrote, "To have reached the age of 40 without ever handling a brush or fiddling with a pencil, to have regarded with mature eye the painting of any kind as a mystery, to have stood agape before the chalk of the pavement artist, and then suddenly to find oneself plunged in the middle of a new and intense form of interest and actions with paints and palettes and canvas, and not to be discouraged by results, is an astonishing and enriching experience." The next step he found more difficult, and as he described in his wonderful little book, Painting as a Pastime, "I started with the sky. It was on that occasion blue." And later he describes how very gingerly I mixed a little blue paint on the palette with a very small brush, and then, with infinite precaution, made a mark about as big as a bean upon the affronted snow-white shield. It was a challenge, a deliberate challenge, but so subdued, so halting, indeed so cataleptic that it deserved no response. At that moment, the loud approaching sound of a motor car was heard in the drive, and from this chariot there stepped, swiftly and lightly, none other than the gifted wife of Sir John Lavery. "Painting? But what are you hesitating about? Let me have a brush, the big one." Splash into the turpentine, wallop into the blue and white, frantic flourish on the palette, clean no longer, and then several large fierce strokes and splashes of blue on the absolutely cowering canvas. Anyone could see that it could not hit back. No evil fate avenged the jaunty violence. The canvas grinned in helplessness before me. The spell was broken. The sickly inhibitions rolled away. I seized the largest brush and fell upon my victim with berserk fury, and I have never felt any awe of a canvas since. Winston was lucky indeed to have such gifted mentors as John and Hazel Lavery to guide his earliest brushstrokes, and what had been a pleasing acquaintance now grew into a warm and lasting friendship. After that, Winston spent as much time as he possibly could in Sir John Lavery's studio, painting with the Laverys, who were both talented artists. Lavery taught him how to paint landscapes, interiors, and portraits. And one of his earliest paintings was of John Lavery at his easel in 1915. This he gave to Lavery, who lent it to the Royal Society of Portrait Painters for their exhibition in 1919. This was the first time one of Winston's works was exhibited. In his biography, John Lavery wrote, "I know few amateur wielders of the brush with a keener sense of light and colour or a surer grasp of essentials. Had he chosen painting instead of statesmanship, I believe he would have been a great master of the brush." At the end of November 1915, Winston decided to resign completely from the government, and as he was also a major in the Oxfordshire Yeomanry, he decided he would like to join them in France, where they were fighting. Major Churchill initially served with the 2nd Battalion of the Grenadier Guards, and subsequently he was made Colonel of the 6th Battalion Royal Scots Fusiliers, which was resting after heavy losses in action. Colonel Churchill threw himself into this job with zest. He found the details of military life absorbing and gave himself over entirely to the daily affairs of his battalion. Only Clementine knew of any bitterness he felt in his heart for the politicians at home. In a letter to her, he says, "I do not ever show anything but a smiling face to the military world, a proper complete detachment and contentment, but so it is a relief to write one's heart out to you." He wrote on the 10th of January 1916, Clementine was not only the trusted and sympathetic recipient of his confidences, she was also a perceptive informant concerning political personalities and affairs on the home front. Winston and Clementine's letters to each other during the 4 months he was to be at the front form a deeply moving correspondence. In January 1916, they moved to a village named Plug Street on the Belgian border. This was very close to the front lines. He writes, "I should only move about 3/4 of a mile from the front line where we are in support and supposed to be resting. Therefore, for the next 2 to 3 months, we shall all dwell continuously in close range of the enemy's artillery." Their headquarters were at Lawrence Farm. It was here that Winston painted several pictures of the desolate scene. One of his officers, Edmund Hakewill Smith, then aged 24, described how Winston started painting the 2nd or 3rd time that he went up to the farm. Each time we were in the line, he spent more time on his paintings. Gradually, too, the courtyard became more pitted with shell holes. And as his painting came nearer to completion, he became morose, angry, and exceedingly difficult to talk to. And after 5 or 6 days in this mood, he suddenly appeared cheerful and delighted like a small boy at school. I asked him what had happened, and he said, "I've been worried I couldn't get the shell hole right in the painting. However I did it, it looked like a mountain. But yesterday I discovered if I put a little bit of white in it, it looked like a hole after all." It was at the end of 1921 that Winston put down on paper his thoughts and feelings about his passion for painting. He wrote 2 articles for the Strand magazine, which became known as painting as a pastime. He wrote that people who discover painting in middle age do not have time for the deliberate approach. 2 years of drawing lessons, 3 years of copying woodcuts, 5 years of plaster casts. These are for the young. They have enough to bear. And this thorough grounding are for those who, hearing the call in the morning of their days, are able to make painting their paramount lifelong vocation. We must not be too ambitious. We cannot aspire to masterpieces. We may content ourselves with a joyride in a paint box, and for this, audacity is the only ticket. He only painted in oils and went on to say, "I write no word in disparagement of watercolours, but there really is nothing like oils. Just to paint is great fun. The colours are lovely to look at and delicious to squeeze out. Matching them, however crudely, with what you see is fascinating and absolutely absorbing. Try it if you have not done so before you die." Winston had never been to an art gallery before 1915. Clementine Churchill told how they went to London's National Gallery that year, and he became totally absorbed in looking at just 1 or 2 paintings, studying the techniques. One of the ways that Winston taught himself to paint was by copying pictures that he admired. He liked the paintings of John Singer Sargent and copied several of these paintings, including the ruins of Arras Cathedral. In January 1921, Winston was in Paris on official business, but took the opportunity to visit Gallery Drouet, where the works of a new artist, one Charles Moran, were being exhibited. The Gallery Drouet was a gallery showing important post-impressionist pictures. Together with the head of the British military mission and an art critic, they studied the pictures for 40 minutes. They were all very impressed, and so they should have been, as the artist Charles Moran was in fact a pseudonym for Winston himself. All the pictures sold and are unfortunately seemingly lost forever. History does not record the prices, but apart from giving one of his paintings for auction, this is the only time that he sold his pictures. In about 1925, Winston entered one of his paintings in an amateur art exhibition and competition. The condition was that none of the paintings were to be signed, so the judges did not know their provenance. Winston entered a painting which he called Winter Sunshine, one of his earliest paintings. The judges were Sir Joseph Duveen, a great patron of the art and benefactor of the National Gallery and the Tate, Kenneth Clark, a young man who became one of the great art historians, and Oswald Burley, the celebrated portrait painter. Oswald Burley gave this account of the judging. Arriving early on the scene, I managed to put out on one side all the pictures which seemed to have any real merit. I especially noticed a picture of a red house in sunlight with snow on the roof, painted with great rigor, to which I decided, being still alone, to award the first prize. Later in the morning, when Duveen arrived, and on showing him my choice of first prize, he disagreed firmly, saying, "No, that is obviously by a professional painter, and this is an amateur show." I answered, we must assume that its author was an honest man, and insisted on it being given the first prize. Kenneth Clark upheld my choice, and so it was settled. And when finally the secretary released the names of the various prize winners, we were all delighted and much interested to find that Winston Churchill had painted Winter Sunshine. And it's in Lady Churchill's sitting room at Chartwell, if any of you visit. Winston greatly appreciated advice from different artists. As well as John and Hazel Lavery, he painted with John Sickert, who had been a friend of Clementine Churchill when she had lived in Dieppe as a child with her mother. Winston had been painting for 12 years when he first met Sickert. He was at home with his brushes, paints, and easel. He had tackled a variety of subjects: landscapes, the sea, interiors, still lives, architecture, and had even ventured into portrait painting. Above all, his passion for painting and his determination to wrestle with the techniques went unabated, and his eagerness to learn were as keen as ever. Despite all his work as a politician and a minister, he missed no opportunity to paint. His paintbox and paraphernalia accompanied him even on the most formal of ministerial visits. Sickert instructed him how to prepare a canvas by creating a cameo, an underpainting of often several layers of paint, composed usually of 2 colours. He also taught Churchill how to use photographs to be used as an aide-memoire to complete a painting later in his studio. Another use of the photograph that he taught him was to make a grid, and there is a picture in his studio at Chartwell called Painting Lesson from Mr. Sickert, which is constructed from a photograph and has Sickert's handwritten instructions in the margin. Writing to Sickert in October 1927, "In Paris, we bought for £3 10 a splendid lantern, apparently a trade product, which throws the positive or negative onto the canvas, exactly the size one wishes. This enables the cameo to be constructed with extraordinary rapidity and accuracy in 4 or 5 tints of monochrome. Either you can do it for the negative and paint the whites black and the blacks white, or you can have a lantern slide made and follow the values directly. I have not had a chance yet of trying a portrait by this method, but I'm sure that there is a very fair likeness can be produced with great certainty." The splendid lantern was to become part of his equipment in his studio. He found that it helped him to overcome his lack of expertise as a draftsman, and using this technique, he painted portraits of friends and family members. Churchill created one of the most striking portraits of his beloved Clementine, painted from a photograph taken when she launched the aircraft carrier HMS Indomitable. Churchill loved the radiant photograph taken of her as she waved the great ship away, and the sketch portrait is full of vitality. Interestingly, this sole portrait of Clementine, using the magic lantern technique, had one problem. Churchill's detective, Sergeant Murray, put the lantern slide into the projector the wrong way round, so this unique painting shows Clementine in mirror image. I'm very lucky to own this special and vibrant painting of such a remarkable and lovely lady. I've loaned it to Chartwell, where it hangs in her sitting room, facing the wonderful portrait by Sir Oswald Burley of her husband. Mary Sames says that although he used these techniques, her memories are almost entirely of him painting directly onto the canvas. Another artist who painted a lot with was Paul Mars. In October 1987, Paul wrote to him after he'd heard him speak in a debate in the House of Commons. "My dear Winston, I was thrilled by every word you said in the House yesterday. As I went down, the usher downstairs said to me, 'You chose a good day to come. He's always fine. None left like him. He always does one good.' I nearly embraced him. I felt so much what he said. I have sent you some brushes. You should destroy most of your old brushes, which can't help you in your work. Paint like you write or speak. Every stroke of the brush must be a statement felt and seen." Churchill also learnt from William Nicholson. He first met this brilliant painter in 1934, when he came to Chartwell to paint a conversation piece of Winston and Clementine to commemorate their silver wedding. And many years later, Winston told Sir John Rothenstein, the director of the Tate Gallery, that William Nicholson was the person who taught him most about painting. Winston loved to paint on holidays. He spent many painting holidays staying with friends in the south of France and Marrakesh. During the Second World War, he only painted one picture, the sun setting over the Atlas Mountains from Marrakesh. he held a conference with President Roosevelt for 10 days in Casablanca in January 1943, and the president was due to fly back to the States via Lagos, then to Dakar, across to Brazil, then home to Washington. Such a dangerous and strenuous trip. Winston, at the last moment, persuaded the president to visit Marrakesh, telling him that he wished to spend 2 days with him to show him this Paris of the Sahara and to wonder at the sight of the sun setting over the Atlas Mountains. The president was persuaded. Winston supplied the picnic, and the 150-mile journey across the desert into the hills began. Life was different then, and the dangers immense. The 5-hour drive was spent in both serious and light-hearted discussion. The route was guarded by literally thousands of American troops, and when they stopped beside the road for a picnic, armored personnel carriers, Tommy gun-carrying soldiers, and GIs surrounded them, and the aircraft circled above. Probably the most bizarre picnic in the history of the world. They arrived at Marrakesh, staying at the Villa Taylor, and that evening the president was carried in a chair up to the roof of the tower of the villa, where they enjoyed the splendor of the sun setting over the snow-covered Atlas Mountains. They had a fine dinner with lots of laughter and singing. Churchill sang a solo, and the president was about to, but was interrupted. The day of the departure of the president dawned. Winston was still in bed when the president wanted to leave. Unperturbed, Winston jumped out of bed, dressed in his brilliant red dressing gown with dragons on the back and a pair of bedroom slippers, and came down to say farewell to his friend. And at the last moment, as tired as he was, he drove to the airport with him, even going onto the plane to settle the president, and admiring the courage of this fine man with his physical disabilities. Winston then returned to the villa and painted the view across Marrakesh to the snowy Atlas Mountains, and later presented this fine and unique painting to the president. After the war, tired and disappointed, having lost the election, he borrowed a house on the shores of Lake Como from his friend Earl Alexander, the wartime general. Sarah Churchill, in her wonderful little book, A Thread in the Tapestry, says in a letter to her mother that when Alex came to the house to visit, they talked painting most of the time. She writes, "Last night I heard them wandering around the house, theoretically touching up the positively frightful pictures there, and Papa saying, 'Now come here, Alex, come here, now really look at this. We really paint better than the bastard that painted this one.'" Sarah goes on to say, "I really think that he is over it. It's hard to tell, but he said last night, 'Every day I stay here without news, without worry, I realize the truth of what your mother said, a blessing in disguise. The war is over, it is won, and they've lifted the hideous aftermath from my shoulders. I am what I never thought I would be until my grave, sans souci et sans regret. The only thing he misses is you." And writing to his daughter Mary, he writes at the same time, "Here it is sunshine and calm. I paint all day and every day, and have banished care and disillusionment to the shades." Alex came and painted too. He is very good. In the house, Sarah writes, there were indeed some perfectly frightful pictures, and one above all he sat and stared at every evening. It was of a stagnant, murky pool, and reflected some funereal shrubbery. 2 sombre fir trees blotted out much of the sky, which looked reminiscent of a London fog, and peering out biliously between the trees was a pale and sickly sun. That picture became the butt and focus of Alex and my father the evening they were together. And after Alex had left, Papa was sitting staring as usual at the offending picture, when, suddenly turning to us, he said, "We are all agreed, are we not, that this is the worst picture that has ever been painted?" We murmured assent. It takes the palm, the prize for bad pictures. You must say it's offensive." Again we nodded our assent. In a twinkling of an eye, the picture was off the wall, was prized out of its frame, and was being carried triumphantly up to the bathroom, which was being used as a studio, to be doctored. Charles Moran groaned. "He oughtn't to do it, he oughtn't to do it." "Oughtn't he?" I asked. "No," said Charles, "but you won't stop him," and taking up the banner of passive resistance, went off to bed. I leapt upstairs, where my father was squeezing great daubs of vivid colour. The two boys, they were his secretaries, sat on the edge of the bath, goggle-eyed. I delivered my lecture. "You really mustn't," I said, as the first vivid red hit the gloomy canvas. My voice trailed away. Suddenly, beautiful flaming azaleas appeared on the dingy shrubbery. The dingy firs were given back the new green of their youth. The pallid sun, instead of trying to break through the fog with fitful gleam, sank in a splurge of glory, and the fog, as if by magic, disappeared, and the happiest of blue skies smiled down on the whole scene, which had been caught by the hitherto stagnant repellent pool, now a kaleidoscope of reflections. It was breathtaking, it was enchanting, it was lovely. The whole thing accomplished and back in its frame and back on the wall inside half an hour. We sat and admired it for 2 hours, exhausted but satisfied by this act of artistic rape, as my father called it. And early next morning, one by one, we tiptoed down to have a look. What would the morning reveal? Well, do you know, it was still lovely. It glowed brazenly like a bird of paradise, and we were all broken-hearted when it was once more carried upstairs to have its face washed. It now hangs back on the wall, stagnant and gloomy as before. In 1947, Churchill was to achieve a goal he could certainly never have imagined. The president of the Royal Academy, Sir Alfred Munnings, suggested that he should enter some of his paintings by hanging in the Royal Academy's summer exhibition. Churchill, after some persuasion, agreed, but said they should be entered under a pseudonym. The pictures he chose were Winter Sunshine, the one that had won the earlier competition, and the Loo River, which he had painted in the 30s. He sent them in under the name David Winter. It was only once they had been accepted that he told them his real name. The following year, he entered 3 paintings, this time under his name, and later the Royal Academy elected him as an honorary academician extraordinary. This was an honour that he greatly prized. In December 1950, after a vigorous election campaign, Winter Sunshine and the prospect of painting beckoned, so he returned to Marrakesh. He had discovered a new and fascinating place to paint, Tinahir, which he described to Clementine as a sunlight painting paradise. To get to this valley of great gorges of marble and red stone required a flight over the Atlas Mountains. The party of 14, including Clementine and Diana, nearly didn't make it, as one of the party, Walter Graebner, was to describe. Churchill always smoked on takeoff, but this time, as the plane raced down the runway, he decided to take no chances and tried to ram his burning 6-inch cigar into the receptacle on the arm of his chair when he found that the cigar was too big for the ashtray. He lifted the metal container out of the arm, depositing the cigar in the hole, replacing the container, and settled down for a snooze. Hardly had the plane left the ground and started the sharp climb over the Atlas Mountains when the smell of burning cigar permeated the cabin and a cloud of smoke enveloped him. He realized something was wrong and called the stewardess. Together they discovered the source of the fire, and in a few minutes enough water was poured down the hole to extinguish it. But Churchill was determined to make doubly sure that the fire was really out. Grabbing his steel-pronged walking stick, he proceeded to ram it down the hole and bash the cigar at the bottom. Still not satisfied, he sent for one of the officers and demanded that the cigar be retrieved. And then, when this was done, he announced, "Now we can go over the mountain." Although Winston mainly painted landscapes, he also painted a considerable number of still lifes, flower paintings and interiors, as well as portraits. I love his flower paintings and also the many trees that he painted. His paintings are a wonderful record of the private side of his life, of the places that he visited, the houses like Blenheim Palace, Chartwell and Trent Park, which meant so much to him, and the portraits of his family and friends. Churchill loved bright colours. He wrote, "I rejoice with the brilliant ones and am generally sorry for the poor browns. When I get to heaven, I mean to spend a considerable portion of my first 1,000,000 years in painting. I expect orange and vermilion will be the darkest, dullest colours. There will be a whole range of wonderful new colours which will delight the celestial eye." This unknown to some side of this great man, his paintings gave such enormous pleasure to him, seeing him through good times and bad times, dark days and bright days. His books and speeches are well known, his paintings less known. He painted over 500 pictures, which he referred to as his daubs. I spent 6 years tracking them from collections round the world for my book. This has been an enormous pleasure to me, but now the task has been, with a few exceptions, completed. I was so pleased to have been able to place in digital format at Churchill College, Cambridge, as an addition to the great archive of his paintings, of his papers and speeches, his paintings. For 40 years, he gained so much pleasure from his pastime, from the moment that he walked in the garden at Hoe Farm, cast down with misery by the catastrophe of the Dardanelles. His life was changed. He wrote, "Happy are the painters, for they shall not be lonely. Light and colour, peace and hope will keep them company to the end, or almost to the end of the day." Thank you so much. And now, with Simon's help, we're going to show you a few of his paintings and photographs of him painting. Are you going to take over there? Wonderful.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm afraid we're running a little bit late, so I'm afraid the slideshow that we're going to have will be a little bit rushed, but please forgive me for that. But thank you very much indeed, Minnie. I normally start this part of the little presentation with a funny little Churchill story. Some of these stories I'm never sure if they're true, and I want them to be true if they're not true, and let's hope they are. But Churchill, apparently during the war, was having a meeting with the Americans and was staying for a number of days and was sitting in a little cabin, apparently on his bed with the door open, in his shorts and his vest, and suddenly an apparition appeared at the door, a GI, who suddenly addressed him and said, "Hey, Fatso, where's the John?" Churchill sat there for a moment, rather glowering at him, and said, "You leave my cabin, you turn left, it's the second door on the right, it's the one that says gentleman, but don't be put off by that." I hope it was true. As Minnie mentioned, Churchill started to paint down at Hoe Farm, and this is one of the very, very first pictures that he painted. These never reproduce very well as a PowerPoint presentation, but of course a lot of you will have seen many, many, many of his pictures, certainly down at Chartwell and elsewhere, and they are quite stunning. His use of bright colours are fantastic. But I think the artistry in this particular picture, which has got Goonie, his sister-in-law, in it, is quite exceptional for a beginner painter. Whilst doing the book, it was wonderful to try and find photographs of Churchill, and this is the only one with Clementine Churchill in the picture that we were able to find. And I'm moving on fairly quickly, and as Minnie mentioned, when he went back to the trenches, not happy wearing a British officer's steel helmet, he found the French officer's steel helmet far more comfortable, and so during the whole of his time over in the trenches, and he really was in action, he wore a French officer's steel helmet. And many of you who've been at Chartwell will have seen this photograph and also a painting of him wearing the helmet, and the helmet is there and it's on the stairs, if you remember. As Minnie mentioned, Lawrence Farm. This, I think, was the picture where he was able to put a little bit of white round the artillery holes shell holes in the buildings, and by adding the little bit of white, get it right. Minnie mentioned the picture that he put into the competition, Chartwell Under Snow. And I am being very, very quick going through these. And Minnie mentioned the wonderful ability that he had to project onto the canvas this wonderful photograph of Clementine Churchill launching HMS Indomitable, which of course he put in the wrong way around. And Minnie mentioned that she had loaned it to Chartwell, where it now hangs in Lady Churchill's sitting room. And the reason, of course, that she loaned it to Chartwell was she wanted people to understand how beautiful and how wonderful she was. And so it's very special that it is now in Chartwell, where everybody can enjoy it. And one of the interesting things that happened to us, the picture went to Chartwell when we moved from Squaries in Westerham down to the West Country. And Minnie had asked Carol Kenwright, the then director at Chartwell, if they would like it on loan, and of course they said yes. So we arrived at the house, and unfortunately we just put the picture in the boot of the car, or the trunk of the car, as you Americans would say, and lots of people came out of the house with white gloves, horrified to see it had just been stuffed into the boot. Anyway, it was very carefully and gently taken from us, and we were told that the picture would be hung up in the house after the house had closed. The following morning, somebody took the first tour around the house and was standing in Lady Churchill's sitting room with his back to this now new painting, and he pointed out all the various relevant things in the room, and he was doing terribly well until he said, "And behind me is an old turkey." And there had in fact been a painting of a turkey that had looked as though it had been in a very bad fight and lost, which now sits in the director's office. And he realized from the expression on people's faces that he'd said something wrong, and so of course turned around for the first time to see this beautiful picture of Clementine Churchill, and he was horrified and said, I'm so sorry, I've never seen this picture before." And very amusingly, when we go around the house, I often tell that story, and the person, one of the wonderful volunteers in the room, almost always says, that story is perfectly true, but it wasn't me. Minnie mentioned the only picture that Churchill painted during the Second World War, which is the view across Marrakesh to the Atlas Mountains. Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt now own it, and I think paid more than $3.5 million for it. And Minnie also mentioned that immediately after the war he went down to Lake Como, where he painted, and he painted alongside Earl Alexander, this was Earl Alexander's house, on one of the days that he visited. And so Alexander sat beside Churchill, and they both painted the same picture. And if you've been to Chartwell recently, you will notice in the corridor just outside Lady Churchill's bedroom, these two pictures now hang together. And the reason they hang together is that Minnie was told by her son Jack that the picture painted by Alexander was coming up for sale at Christie's, and we were going away somewhere. Minnie asked Jack, her younger son, if he would bid for it, and he was successful. And so having received the picture, which on the back of it says painted with Winston Churchill, September 1945, so Minnie has loaned it to Chartwell and put it, of course, in the most appropriate place, which is alongside this picture. So they now are back together, united as they were in those days immediately after the war. But do look out for that picture. Tina here, we're running terribly over, so I'm just going to whip through these pictures. He copied other artists' pictures, and this is the ruins at Arras Cathedral. fog at Roehampton, and poppies at Lullington. Wonderful architectural painting at Esher Place. Thank you, Minnie. The pyramids in Egypt, and earlier you heard about his trips through the Middle East. As colonial secretary, he did this trip in, I think, 1921 from Egypt, and then, I'll just go back a moment, to Egypt and then on to Jerusalem. But whilst he was in Egypt, with Lawrence of Arabia over on the right, Churchill is about fourth from the left. Immediately after this picture was taken, they had a race around the pyramids, and Churchill fell off, but remounted and finished the race. But he then went on to Jerusalem and painted this wonderful picture of the sun setting over Jerusalem. And it was during this period that as colonial secretary, that the borders of Iraq were decided. And it was at that particular time that Churchill was advising and almost insisting that the Kurds be given a separate homeland of their own, but the Foreign Office would have none of it. And so, of course, the existing boundaries or borders of Iraq were put in place. How much better it would have been if the Kurds had had their own homeland. You've probably seen them just recently, tapestries at Blenheim. Another lovely photograph of Churchill painting. And we love to try and find the actual paintings where there are photographs of him painting. Wonderful architectural picture. I'm rushing right through. This beautiful picture is owned by Prince Charles. This next one is owned by the Queen. And he loved painting water and trees, and I think this is a particularly beautiful picture, which he gifted to Lloyd George. Lovely trees, and I'm whipping through Lake Schwazi, more beautiful trees. Very large canvas, which hangs on the stairs at Chartwell. Forgive me for going through, but I don't want to steal the time of the next people. Wonderful Fontaine de Vaucluse. I'll tell you the very, very quick story of this. He went after the Second World War and painted at Vaucluse and went to the source of the river, and he settled down nicely on the bank of this river, and it had wonderful green weed which was picked up by the sun. And he'd got himself nicely set up with his easel and his paints and what have you. And he was about to start painting when there was a tap on his shoulder, and a very, very angry French woman was standing behind him with all her washing. And she said, "Excuse me, this is my place. This is where I do my washing. Move." I don't think she knew who he was, but I'm sure they came to a good compromise. But he also wanted to go, while he was there, to the actual source of the river. And in this wonderful little village, there was the most wonderful donkey that spent its whole time pulling the garbage truck around the village. And the donkey was called Chocolat. So Chocolat was obtained and brought to Churchill, where he rode up to the top of the hill to see the source of the river, and then it carried him back down into the town. And unfortunately, Chocolat went back the next day to doing its normal duties of carting around the rubbish, but it had a very special day. And there is a wonderful photograph of Churchill on Chocolat. Once again at Vaucluse, and Vaucluse, and Vaucluse, more water, and I'm going to go very, very quickly through because I'm stealing other people's time. Venice, one on the Var, and the nuns at the Béguinage, very quickly. He used to take an aide-memoire afterwards, and that was a photograph to finish the picture in the studio. But Grace Hamlin, his lovely secretary, who in fact owned this picture, told me that he made the poor nuns walk up and down for 7 hours while he did this picture. Wonderful. I'm so sorry, I'm flashing right the way through because we really are running over. I love it. Wonderfully dressed with his hat and cigar and having a wonderful time. This I particularly like. And once again, we found the picture, which is this one, that he's painting in this photograph. And this lovely painting is also one owned by Minnie. And the house on the left belonged to her uncle, who came by one day and said, "Gosh, you've got a lovely painting of my house." And this was painted from La Caponcina, Lord Beaverbrook's house just near Monte Carlo. Study of boats, once again La Caponcina. Wonderful southern France, harbours in Marrakesh. Marrakesh, the wonderful mosque, the Koutoubia Mosque, and across the mountains. Lovely, it looks like a lonesome photograph, but apparently in this photograph, if one was able to turn round, there were about 1,000 people watching him paint. But it looks like a lonely little person, doesn't it? And the bus, I could tell you a long story about that. Maybe I shall tell you over various people over dinner. But this is the only bus that he did. The Queen had commissioned a bust of Churchill, and Oscar Nimon was the person asked to do it. And you can imagine Churchill was a dreadful sitter, and he wasn't prepared to sit still. And he persuaded Oscar Nimon, if he was going to sit still, to teach him how to sculpt. And so Churchill actually did this bust of Oscar Nimon while Oscar Nimon was doing the bust of Churchill. Wonderful magnolia from outside wall on Chartwell, and wonderful flowers. The view of Chartwell, which no doubt all of you have seen. The studio. Over the Weald of Kent, and I'm rushing to finish because I have to tell a very quick story about this picture, I'm afraid. I'm so sorry. I will share it with you. This is in the dining room, and you've probably all seen it, and he collected one Christmas these lovely bottles together. And we had Mary Soames down to stay for 4 or 5 days. And I'm fairly brave, and Mary was fairly formidable, but I thought I would risk it and ask her. And I said, "Mary, I've heard a little story about you, and I just wonder if it's true." She gave me a rather old-fashioned look and said, "What story is that, Simon?" So I said, "Well, apparently, when you were fairly young, sort of 14 or 13, you overheard your parents planning a lunch party, and your mother was suggesting various people to come to lunch, and your father was saying, yes, 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 until a Mrs. So-and-so, so-and-so was mentioned. And Winston apparently said, 'Oh my God, not that lion hunter.' Anyway, the day arrived and the lunch was duly put on. And in those days, the children were required to come and join the dining table and join in the conversation, quite rightly. And at one moment during lunch, there was a bit of a lull. And Mary thought she ought to do her duty, and she looked down the table at Mrs. So-and-so, so-and-so, and said, "Mrs. So-and-so, so-and-so, have you shot any lions lately?" So I said, "Mary, was the story true?" And she gave me, once again, a rather old-fashioned look, and she said, "Unfortunately, Simon, it was true. But you don't know what happened next, do you?" So I said, "No, Mary, I don't." She said, "I was bodily picked up from my chair and rushed out of the room, never to be asked to join the dining, come to the dining table again." Lovely story. Black swans at Chartwell, wonderful Chartwell. The Papal Palace at Avignon, more water. And we're way over time now, so I will just rush through these. Lovely pictures. I mean, his pictures are so pleasing. So with that, I'm going to say thank you very, very much indeed. And I'm so sorry it's been very rushed. And thank you all for coming.